Hi, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Unlocking Venture Capital. I'm here with my friend Shreya. Hi, Shreya, how are you doing?
Hi, Sydney. I'm great. I'm loving the New York fall.
Yes, absolutely. So, Shreya is from Women Who Build podcast, as well as a former VC at Aureolis VC. So, I'm very excited to learn about her international investing experience and more about her background and journey. So, please give us a little bit of background about, how you got into VC and what you are seeing in today's landscape. Would love to understand your take.
Absolutely. So, I actually come from India, as you may have guessed, and I started my career in investment banking. So I was nowhere close to startups or technology. And in investment banking, I worked with financial institutions group, which is like, serving clients in the management sector, in insurance sector, banks, and stuff like that. So after investment banking, I did both in India and the US. I moved back to India and helped build companies in education and women's health. It was an interesting time, really got the operator experience of being on ground, seeing how students learn, seeing how teachers teach within the education sector. Within the women's health sector, I went into the company knowing nothing about even PCOS, and ended up learning a lot about how there is a lack of primary data around women's health, how there are some leadership lessons that I'd still not learned. So I really learned my worst and my best leadership lessons during my time at the women's health company. And eventually, I realized that I'm more of a horizontal person, which means that for me, it wasn't women's health only or education only. I was also in Bangalore, which is one of the more entrepreneurial cities in India. And that time I was meeting with founders in space tech, in climate tech. They were doing some interesting things. I also realized that I was able to draw parallels amongst different sectors. So, say for example, if you say that for a good health company, it's important to have a strong focus on health outcomes. I was actually applying some of those learnings to even education company. For
Mhm.
you to have a good education company, it's important to have a very strong focus on education outcomes. So I realized that I was doing the work of an investor without even realizing that I wanted to be an investor. And that's also when I was fortunate to be in touch with Paula Mariwala. She's actually, in fact, one of India's first women investors. And yeah, and in around 2020, she was already thinking about the sectors that nobody in India was really talking about, in the sense that climate tech. Now everyone talks about climate tech in India. Nobody really knew what climate tech was. People still talked about global warming and floods, etc., but nobody, and air pollution, which is actually very rampant in India. But
Hmm.
nobody really talked about climate tech and deep technology to solve climate change, per se, which Paula was. And the other interesting thing was that she was planning to launch a new investment firm. I realized that I love building things from scratch from my operator experience. So it was really a combination of me being a horizontal person, me wanting to build something from scratch that made
Hmm.
me excited about the opportunity of joining Paula to help build Aureolis Ventures. So we did that, and I think had a wonderful experience. I was fortunate to be mentored by Paula. And in addition to that, I realized that throughout my journey, I have really not seen too many women around me running businesses. And
Yeah.
I thought that maybe, you may resonate with it. And in fact, most women I tell actually resonate with it. So I quickly realized that it wasn't a problem that was unique to me. It was everywhere. And it wasn't only in India, but it was also in the US, which is
Yeah.
also the second geography that I worked in. So I realized, okay, let's do something about it. I just didn't know what it would be. So it was during the second wave of the pandemic. I'd gone back home and I saw that my 13-year-old niece started baking. And she started baking cookies and brownies and posting pictures of her stuff on Instagram. And she was also very entrepreneurial about it, in the sense that she would change the angle of the camera, just in case today the engagement is low, or she would change the background of the image if the engagement is low. And that I found very entrepreneurial. So I asked her, okay, what do you want to do about it? You spend about an hour, about 2 hours every day on this. What do you want to do about this? So she said that, hey, I want to start a bakery business, but she deferred everything to her father. And that's when I, researched women in entrepreneurship. I looked on Google. Obviously, the 10, 15 articles all talked about how only 2% of venture funds actually go to women.
Yep.
I spoke to around 80 women in technology. So these were really a combination of founders and investors, both in India and the US. They were, they talked about the beautiful work that they're doing. Someone is even on the board of a Fortune 500 company. And they were very excited, when they talked about their work. But towards the end of the conversation, there was always some form of, hey, I'm a woman and my life is very hard. And that I thought, exactly,
That
right?
is
And
a great podcast title, actually.
that, oh, yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, I love that. Yeah, but then I realized that if we keep talking about this over and over again, then there is a sense of negativity that gets, into the minds of young women like you, like me, like my niece, who then do not even take the first step towards starting up. And therefore, I started Women Who Build podcast, and I actually recently moved back to New York. And yeah, it's been an interesting time ever since.
Yeah. I want to dig a little bit deeper into this. So like um what part of your passion and your mission were you able to just bring to your VC work when you were in VC? Because you have seen a lot of emerging trends, a lot of innovation, but a lot of also emerging trends, not just in technology, but also in social classes. And so when you were able to be an international investor, for the first time, how did you bring your mission forth? Because right now I do find a lot of people, and this also came about in a previous podcast as well that I did with another young lady, and she was talking about, just kind of wanting to find your why as an investor, right? And that
Yeah.
wasn't always easy. And, people always want to bring what they can to help the founders move forward and bring extra value as an investor. So, what was your space that you felt that, okay, this is my calling, this is what I was supposed to be doing, and this is how I brought my previous experiences here and, drawing from these learnings.
Yeah, absolutely. I think one thing that I have realized just as an individual, I won't talk about it as an investor, and maybe we can talk about as an investor later, is that so I come from a very small town in India, and it's in the central part of India. Not too many people know about it, but it's like 3 hours away from Delhi. And whenever I tell them the name, I say, hey, I'm from Gwalior, which is 3 hours away from Delhi, which is the capital of India. So
That's how you explain it the whole every time.
yeah, because
Good.
then they don't know where it is, Typically,
Yeah.
people definitely know about Delhi, Bombay, Bangalore, but they don't know about Gwalior as much. And so, just growing up, I used to consider it a disadvantage, because, I thought maybe I don't have access to opportunities that people in Delhi have access to. And I used to ask my parents to move themselves to Delhi, move us to Delhi. But that obviously never happened. But then, over the years, I've realized that the very fact that I was born in a smaller town versus Delhi actually was a blessing. It was a blessing because in investing or in any professional career that you take up, it's not important to have the same insights or similar insights as your peers. What actually makes you stand out is if you have a different insight versus everyone else. Now, I'm not saying that you have an insight for the heck of it. I
Yeah.
mean, right? But it actually has to have some meaning with regards to your career. In investing, it could mean you've identified an opportunity that has a large enough market for you to tap into. You understand the customer, a small town customer, better than a large town or a large city metro customer.
Yeah.
And that's because you have grown up living that life,
Mm.
so that is exactly what I appreciate about my background. And that's something I call it really identifying undervalued opportunities. And I call them undervalued because a large majority of investors that I at least saw in India were not as geographically diverse. So I considered that my advantage. And
Yeah.
in fact, I even invested in a company called Drink Prime, which is, a water purifier subscription business. And nobody was really looking at it. They started, these two founders actually started selling water cans in small, housing communities. But these were mostly in metro communities, but still, like the customers were actually coming from small town migrating to metros, and therefore their mentality was still that of a small town, right? And their willingness to actually bring out money out of the wallet was very, like, it was very, they just did not want to spend money. So
Mhm.
what these guys did is that they changed the raw material of the water purifier in such a way that the cost came down dramatically, and then they were able to sell the water purifier subscription at a way lower rate versus what it would have costed otherwise,
Okay.
right? And it was a big deterrent to actually purchase your first water purifier, because a water purifier in India is very expensive. It could
Oh,
cost somewhere around $200 to $300 in first go, and then $10 to $15 per month for subscription. And this is for a family that actually in urban India that has an annual income of around $7,000. And so it's a big deterrent, right? And
yeah.
therefore they were serving the real people of small town who had that mentality and who could not shell out money, that much money in one go. So that is something, and it was very operationally heavy. So no venture investor was looking at it, but it was still a
Uh,
very good business. It was a very, I would say cash flow generative business.
yeah.
And it was a very, business that could actually serve the customer if you were able to create the right customer delight.
Yeah.
And yeah, so, it was an exciting one. And it was, in fact, my first investment
That is so
ever.
exciting.
So I actually definitely made some investments in fixed income as a kid when I just started out, when I
Like all
started earning.
kids do. Yes.
Yeah, like all kids do. But I would say this was my first startup investment.
Yes, but that's
Yeah.
the riskiest type of investment.
Yes.
And I think that's something a lot of people don't really like structurally see when they're either building or when they're getting their first investor job. Either way, right? It's
Yeah,
not like you don't understand how this asset class really works unless you really see it in comparison to other asset classes. Not like if you just
absolutely.
compare it on its own. On its
Yeah, I
own, it
love that.
sounds brilliant.
Yeah, I really like your point of taking a portfolio approach, right? Like looking at different asset classes and then finally deciding whether or not they should angel invest.
Yeah. And that's really interesting too, because when it comes to places outside of the US, because obviously VC came from the US and Silicon Valley and the Google story, all that stuff, right?
Yeah,
And so
yeah,
that's like a very glorified approach and story as it is. But
yeah,
if you are kind of seeing other ecosystems, so when I was expanding my product when I was founder in Hong Kong and China, the investors that I met asked a very interesting question. They're like, "Oh, you work with a lot of startups in Canada and US. Do you have any startups that are like 24 months from IPO?" And I'm like, "That is not a startup. You don't know how this. Why is this a question?" Well, like because yeah, because to them they're like, oh, startup is anything that isn't an IPO. First, that's not even where majority of exits even go to.
yeah,
Majority of exits go into some kind of M&A deal instead.
yeah,
And
yeah,
and yeah, and so like thinking about how the mentality of some investors in different ecosystems are thinking about that get rich quick thing is
yeah,
very different because a lot of angel investments are not going to really pan out towards an exit. That's
exactly.
why you would take a portfolio approach in the first place. And then what it means to other investors in different places is wildly different. And it could heavily impact the founders depending on whose check they take, right? And so, the North American approach that you and I are from are so into being there for the long term and bringing value. And also, just in that way, competing with each other for the best kinds of founders and deals and things like that, too, in a both competitive and collaborative way that I think is still very a little too new to a lot of other ecosystems in other
Yeah.
countries, if you'll agree. And so I was wondering also because I know that you also had international investments in your portfolio and things like that. Did you find a difference in the approach of U.S. investors wanting to collaborate and co-invest with you versus international investors that wanted to collaborate and co-invest with you? And like, can you share a story about a time that you've learned something very interesting about that experience?
Yeah. So I think two things, and one of the one of the differences you only pointed out that investors in the US are, while they are competitive, they are also collaborative
Yeah.
because I believe, and I'm sure some of the US investors that I also met with believe that in collaboration, there is value accretion across all stakeholders, right? It's not that let's just compete and get it done with, and whoever gets the best number is the winner, because these are really like small startups that you are investing in early stages, and then they grow in whichever direction, right? And you never know at the time of your investment as to which direction that they will go in. So it's just sometimes better to collaborate versus compete. So that's one. And there are obviously like great investors in India as well who follow this approach, but I thought that in the US I saw more collaboration.
Yeah, me too. Yeah.
Yeah. And then the second thing that I saw is really and this is also taking shape in India gradually as the level of sophistication in financial services and also the complexity within the startup structure is increasing, is that for certain sectors such as climate tech, right? There's it's not important that it's only the VC money that will go in. In fact, the climate tech
Yeah.
capital stack is evolving, right? With the passage of IRA in the US, the financial statements of a climate tech startup are actually entirely different.
Mhm.
Sometimes the DOE gives you money to be able to build your startup, right? And I was just talking to someone who's working in the biotech space, and she talked about how she got a grant to build up on her idea, right? So now the thing is that there are different capital sources. Um, and within India, it was all about, okay, you're starting a company, be it in the retail space, be it in the technology space, let's just go out and get venture money. Now, it does not necessarily work like that all the time, right? Because the venture investors have their own demands, they have their own thesis, they have their own duration,
Yeah.
right? And they may or may not invest in you because it's not a venture investable business. And therefore, how do you identify different capital sources for your startup?
Yes.
And there were times when founders thought that taking a grant is probably, the worst thing that they can do. But sometimes it's great because you do not end up diluting your cap table,
Why would it
right?
be the worst thing you could do? That's the first
Because
thing that you should do.
the positioning is that if you cannot get venture capital, then you're probably bad,
Oh
you
my
know?
gosh, that is first that's just an ego thing as opposed to a
Yeah.
money. It almost has nothing to do with the amount of money. Like, what if you get $1 in venture capital and you get $1 million in grants? Does that really
Exactly.
make you good or bad?
Exactly. And that's but I do think that in India that thinking is definitely changing
Yeah.
as some of the founders in India are actually coming from the US. They've studied in the US and now they're coming back to the country and starting
Okay.
something
That's
together. So
really great.
seen
Yeah.
we've seen the ecosystem
Yeah.
there. And the second is it's just the nature of the business, you cannot always raise venture money for a retail startup that you have because it just doesn't, the thesis just doesn't match. Right?
Tell your niece then when she wants to open a bakery. Oh.
Exactly.
Oh my gosh. It's so interesting because I see like yes, you hit on such a great point where money is not valued the same depending on where you take it from. It is valued so differently, and yet founders are like, I need 500,000 to do this. And
Yeah.
you're like, okay, but where is it coming from? What are the criteria? What is it that you're looking for? And how long is it supposed to last you? So all of these things are really related to money. And what's so interesting is like founders, just like adults, are not educated on how to like financially plan. This is not something we
Right.
ever learned in school. This is something we should all
Yeah.
learn in school. And this is
Absolutely.
also something we expect investors to help us with and be extremely knowledgeable of, not all of which are true. And then the other thing is just like when you have things like government grants and government subsidies and things like that, if you don't use it, it goes to waste. So if
Yeah.
not enough people even apply for it, you just don't have it the next year. So you can't really like just sit on it and expect that it's going to be available all the time. That's not really true. And if it's not going to you, it's going to go to someone else, maybe less deserving than what
Yeah.
you. founded. And a lot of people, as you know, there's certain kinds of founders, if you don't ask, you don't get.
Yeah. It's like college aid, you know. It gets wasted if you don't take it.
Yes, no, that's very true. And
Yeah.
so, these kinds of learnings I think is so interesting to imagine. Have you ever had to like then negotiate with or for a founder, but then regarding, international business, international investors, and was that very, very different in terms of your experiences versus how U.S. founders are working? So, like for example, one of my friends actually very recently was coming up to me and he gave me a term sheet to look over, and it had non-dilution clauses, which is very unusual in New York, right? And so like
Yeah.
it's just kind of like, oh, okay. And he goes, is this normal? I'm like, nothing about this contract is normal. And
Yeah.
so I'm like, but it depends on like who's going to allow you to also be in the same round. And I
Yeah.
think that's also really important because it changes the value of money for founders and
Yeah.
people, especially I was a female founder as well. I would not know if it was my first time that I was allowed to renegotiate back.
Oh, okay. Yeah, in terms of like what we've seen, I would not say it's different, but what we've seen more often with US investors or US startups is that they raise based on safe, right?
A
Like
lot,
the
yeah.
first few a lot.
It came from the US though.
Yeah, exactly. It came from the, but I think other than the YC companies as well, they actually just
They do it a
raise
lot,
based on
yeah.
safe,
Hmm.
which is actually not really a thing in India.
That's so
But
interesting. Yeah, I don't think it's a thing anywhere else too.
yeah, but they've started to. They make YC safe format. Certain companies still do in India.
Yeah.
They say that, hey, we're gonna follow this.
Mhm.
But some of these companies are actually, either based in the US because they started in the US, they got YC funding or whatever.
Yeah.
But interestingly, their operations are in India.
Okay.
So that's one thing that we've seen. The other thing that I've seen for some of the founders who are actually wanting to go to India is just like a lot of fear around getting to India.
Let's talk
And
about this fear. Why did they tell you that they had fear?
I think it's just some random negative connotation around India that,
But they chose it.
someone's gonna scare you away, someone's
Okay.
gonna like steal your stuff and maybe but I'll tell you that it's not that scary. I've lived there for most of my life and it's not. In fact, the metro cities where you are more likely gonna build in, Bangalore, Delhi, Bombay, these are super safe, and we have international people working there all the time. These are cosmopolitan cities. And I talk about this specifically because I see so many business ideas that can actually be transported to India. But it's just, I mean, obviously, since you work with founders as well, you may have noticed that more often than not, building a company or growing a company is about the mindset, right? And
Yeah.
if you have such a ripe market sitting in India, then why not just like make the leap? So that's one that I have seen, and I'll tell you that it's not scary at all. If it's scary, I mean, I can hop on a call and tell you that it's not.
It's not, guys.
And I've lived in the US also, right? And I think sometimes the US can be scary. Certain areas can be scary. In India, certain areas can be scary. But that's
It is so
one.
different from like a founder wanting to expand in the US from India versus a founder in the US wanting to expand in
Yeah.
India. Like
Yeah.
there's so many different policies and different restrictions that are restricting both sides. But one side has massive opportunity to get to expand more
Yeah.
and be able to explore more if there wasn't that like huge sense of fear, like you said, which makes,
Yeah.
it's very
Yeah.
interesting. But do they
Yeah.
have fears in terms of their business, about their expansion, and just like kind of you don't know what you don't know kind of a fear?
Yeah. Absolutely. So I was just speaking with this founder who's working in the fertilizer space in the US. And he wants to potentially launch in India in about a couple of years. But then, with regards to the business model in itself, we were just discussing this. It just doesn't make sense for him to actually build up a full distribution network within India when there is already a bunch of companies and especially listed companies within the chemical and fertilizer spaces
Wow.
in
Okay.
India, right?
Okay.
So what they can do is that they can strike the right corporate partnerships on the ground level because these are very deeply rooted partnerships. If you think about like fertilizers, right? Where are they used? They are used in huge grasslands. They will not necessarily be in your urban cities. They will be in villages, in like tier two towns, three towns, etc. Right? And these farmlands, since they are in such towns, I do not expect a US founder to go to these towns and build up a team there, right? Although there are like large listed companies that already have a distribution network within these towns, within these villages. And
Okay.
so why not get into partnerships with them and try to sell the technology that you have to this Indian partner
Sure.
versus building an entire team when you already have your foot on the ground in the US. So that's one thing that we are definitely seeing. The second thing is just again coming back to partnership and collaboration. I love it, like for women who build, and you as well, I'm sure, practice this. We day in and day out speak with multiple people and try to partner with them, right? So I think the other thing that we've seen is just like partnership with the government,
Hmm.
and just making sure that there is buy-in from the government as much as possible. For some of the folks that are building out data centers, for example, I see who are trying to, be active in the data center community within India are actually foreign folks. They are not necessarily Indian folks. There are definitely like some larger Indian companies that are working on that,
Hmm.
but there is a lot of foreign interest as well. And that's basically that could be due to the private equity money that is flowing into the sector anyway, right?
Hmm.
But that obviously then means that you have to be very close to the government because these are utilities, these are power companies that you're working with. And these power companies also have the potential to impact your consumers, like your Indian population overall. Right. And so you cannot say that I'll just enter India without knowing the government, without like working with them. So
Yeah.
really, like, how do you develop some of these partnerships? How do you make sure that you have a network enough that helps you facilitate these government partnerships is very critical for you to do anything in India.
Yeah.
It, I think the second piece definitely can be harder for foreign folks, but if you have the right investors, the right investors on your cap table, who are either Indians or they've worked with Indian companies before, I'd say it gets easier.
I think that that's a really good point. So, one of the things that, of course, it helps with a variety of reasons why you would have tier one investors from the Valley or from, other innovation hubs, things like that, because they do have such an expansive role. And more importantly, these investors on your cap table that you've chosen, they have expanded other companies to other regions before. So that
Exactly.
experience is instrumental, especially if you're a first time founder and you don't have any boots on the ground anywhere else because you don't have a team anywhere else.
Yeah.
So I'm really glad that you brought that up because it does add tremendous value to more than just what they're bringing in terms of your funding.
Absolutely. And that's so key. And I see that in, some of the larger private equity players for sure. I'm not talking about venture capital right now. Venture capital definitely has boots on the ground, like some of the larger companies like General Catalyst and Axel and all of those people. But
Yeah.
private equity does it, I mean, in a massive manner, right? Like, for example, I was just reading how they think about, like, Blackstone thinks about buying supermarkets
Oh,
in India versus in the US, or malls in India versus the US. So what they realize in the US is that the US consumer is willing to take a ride, like a long ride to a supermarket to buy something, or long drive, whatever.
mhm.
And for Indians, what they do is that they shop within their vicinity, within their
Yeah.
shop,
Or at their window.
at their window. Exactly. Like whatever is the closest, they would just go there, buy their basic minimum groceries, and come back home.
Interesting.
So, and therefore, like, how do you figure out what is the right real estate to buy is
Yeah.
something that private equity does very well. And they have learnings and, I would say even intellectual and human capital to be able to take some of these calls, for sure. So I really appreciate their model, actually.
I love
Um,
I love
Yeah.
that. And so, and
Yeah.
I also love that you got to share that and you got to share all of these stories. So I want to thank you so much, Shreya, for coming on to an episode of Unlocking Venture Capital.